Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 42nd talk in our virtually speaking series. I apologize that this one isn't about the meaning of life. As we squint at the light at the end of the pandemic tunnel, we have more questions than answers. And tonight I'm delighted to be able to continue the discussion started back in February with Latimerian Bill Emmott on the politics and economics of the post-pandemic world. I am thrilled to have been asked to host this evening. My name is Paul Goldsmith, and I'm a politics and economics teacher here at Latimer Upper School. And I can't wait to spend the next hour in conversation with Bill. Bill's an English journalist, author and consultant, best known as the editor-in-chief of The Economist newspaper from 1993 to 2006. He's written 15 books and worked on 2 documentary feature films. Last year, he co-founded a new non-profit global commission for post-pandemic policy, bringing together 33 scientists, historians, economists, policymakers, strategists, and business people to debate the issues facing us all as we contend with this crisis. He's now chairman of the Trinity College Long Room Hub for Arts and Humanities in Dublin and of the International Institute for Strategic Studies and the Japan Society of the UK in London. Bill was educated at Latimer Upper School and then Mount Magdalen College, Oxford, having graduated with first-class honours at PPE. He's also received the Gerald Loeb Lifetime Achievement Award for Excellence in Business Journalism. His most recent general book is called The Fate of the West, The Battle to Save the World's Most Successful Political Idea. I've read it in preparation for this task. I have to say it was revelatory to me in terms of thinking about the issues that Western liberal democracies face. Just before we start this evening's conversations, I wanted very briefly to tell you a little bit about the Virtually Speaking series. We launched this program of online talks over the summer as a way of bringing the Latimer community together in the absence of our usual social events. Of course, these events are also fundraisers for our bursary appeals. Sorry if you've heard me say this before, but this means a lot to me because in 1950, my father received a bursary to attend Merchant Taylor School in North London, and the benefits of that education has meant that his children and grandchildren have had opportunities that would have otherwise been almost impossible. And finally, a couple of house rules for this evening's talk. Everyone will be on mute, so you can all hear the presentation clearly. Do please feel free to type questions in the chat facility, and I'll ask Bill as many as time allows at the end. Just remains me to welcome Bill Emmott, and let's start with some questions I have for him. Now, Bill, one of the things that you really wanted to get over tonight is that we have a second chance to get things right in terms of coming out of a crisis, because we got it wrong after 2008. How?
Well, good evening, Paul, and thank you very much for hosting me here again. It's always very nice to be asked back for a second time. It's kind of reassuring, and it's nice to continue the conversation. What I mean by a second chance is that I think that we've had in incredibly short time 2 enormous crises of an economic and financial and then political sort, 2008 and then again 2020, 2021. And I think after 2008, when we look back at it, I think what you see is that in many ways, governments in Britain, in the United States, in the main Western European countries, in a way tactically played a blinder. They prevented a Great Depression. Gordon Brown saved the world, as he claimed. And he probably did actually have quite a bit to do with it, along with others. We prevented what could have been an incredibly serious disaster at that time. But then after playing this tactical blinder, I think that our governments then basically made a strategic failure out of it, because very quickly we turned to austerity. Very quickly we sort of drew in our belts and so forth, and failed to notice that there were some long-term social and economic issues that had been left to fester before the crisis that we really needed to be planned for. And then the financial crisis had actually exacerbated those, particularly inequality, regional inequality, but especially between rich and poor, and that sense of alienation, being left behind, produce then political consequences, which we saw, I think, in the Brexit vote in Britain, we saw in the rise of populism in some European countries, and we saw with that man, Donald J. Trump, in the United States. So what we need to do this time is do it better. Tactically, I'm not sure that our governments have played a blinder on the pandemic, but largely we've forgiven them because basically it was almost like an act of God. I think in the view of most public opinions, it's not something that that governments could be expected to have reacted to probably a lot better than they did. But now we've got the chance, having been forgiven, having done pretty well at least preventing disaster in economic and social terms, even if the mortality rates have been terrible. We've now got a question about the strategic consequences. And I don't want to see another strategic failure of inequality being allowed to fester.
So I just want to break down a little bit what you've just said. And if we can start with how after the financial crisis, you say that public investment was reduced because so many countries went for austerity. Why do you think so many countries did go for austerity?
Well, I think it was partly we were afraid of debt. Basically, what had happened in the financial crisis was that what was a private debt problem, an enormous credit bubble, all that playing with derivatives and enormous borrowing for property speculation in some countries and elsewhere, then got absorbed by the public sector, by governments, essentially taking over that debt by one means or another. So suddenly debts looked huge. And David Cameron and George Osborne in Britain thought, well, their credibility as a government depended on them putting forward very quickly a path for reducing that debt, which meant we went into a very long period of austerity, cutting of public services, especially at local level, but also cutting of public investment, because capital investment is always the easiest thing to cut. You cut the future and you pay for the present. And that's what basically happened.
I mean, in fact, that's one of the things that you have as a theme of your book is the problem of democracy. You quote David Runciman, a professor at Cambridge, saying that the genius of democracy is that it can adapt, but the stupidity is that adaptation is always deferred to the next election cycle or generation. So, and you also talk about some of the problems that we would have to do to overcome the problem of an aging population and how much that's being deferred as well. We do seem to defer hard decisions. We do, and that's not totally surprising. I mean, in other words, we've got to win the next election, and we do have a very adaptable economy as well as an adaptable political system. So I think Runciman's right that the genius of democracy is its adaptation, but it has to then not make, it's able to learn from its mistakes, but it better not make those mistakes humongous mistakes, because then that's has a habit of undermining the very foundations of the democracy, of constitutions and so forth. So planning for the long term is difficult in politics. I think we're seeing on climate change, for example, a welcome beginning of a realization that the long term cannot be deferred forever. On aging, I'm not sure that we've yet grasped it enough. Some of the, there's bookshelves of Whitehall are laden with reports on how to deal with long-term care, the aged, and they've not really been implemented, I think, in detail. So that there is a temptation to put off the future, but we have to, as voters and as pressure groups in public opinion, which is what we all are, all on this call, we all need to make our voice heard to say, wait a minute, what about tomorrow? What about your children? Well, but this is an interesting point, because if we move on to the next bit about the inequality that remained, and you talk about inequalities both financial and political, and one of the bits of inequality is the resources that go to the older people in the population compared to younger people, and that's because they vote. I imagine that a major issue is because if one of the competition for power makes these hard decisions harder to take. No better example probably than the fact that both attempts to solve social care, one was called a death tax in 2009, I think, and one was called a dementia tax in 2017. So the opposition are always against it. But also, until young people vote at the same percentage as older people, are we ever actually going to be able to solve this inequality?
Well, I think that we have to work harder to get young people to vote. I mean, basically, young people are disinclined to vote because they like to go to the pub or to keep on putting things off. I can remember voting absolutely enthusiastically in my first election. But then after that, I may not have done. I can't remember, to be honest, whether I did in 1979 or 1983, whether I actually got off my behind and went and voted. And I think that's the trouble. But it could be becoming easier thanks to digital voting, which may well, I think, be the future or part of the future. Even if there are all sorts of security problems with it, I think that electronic digitalization of voting is going to at least make it easier to get the young to vote. This is a bit of a new problem because our age profile has got skewed towards the old. When I was growing up, it was skewed towards the baby boomers who were both post-war, so the majority of the population were actually in the younger age groups, whereas now we've somewhat flipped. So I don't think it's an absolutely insuperable problem. I think one can get younger people to vote, but at any rate, the inequality between young and old is not the biggest worry. I think it's between rich and poor, really, is the biggest concern, and because that's the concern that leads to greater, I think, political instability in the long term.
Yeah, one of there are many causes of that inequality between rich and poor, but one of them is the influence. You talk a lot of special interest groups and interest groups, which you define reasonably widely. And it doesn't matter which country you talk about America, in Britain, in Italy, in Japan. Can you just tell us a bit about these interest groups? Because they're a sort of area that I haven't known as much about, and how they stop inequality being addressed properly.
Well, I think they're a sort of just a feature of life, really. I mean, it's much easier to get agreement on, let's say, an instrument of subsidy or protection or something, if you've got an association, whether they are farmers or a trade union or of steel producers, whatever, than it is to get agreement on a subject across the general population. And so there's a big incentive to band together as interest groups. And then, of course, if you've got concentrations of wealth, either in big companies or in large, rich parts of the population, then they too lobby. And usually the wealthy, of which, in these terms, I have to include myself, believe in theory in higher taxes, but in practice they'd rather they didn't pay them. And so we have also a sort of self-denial problem in that it's rather like climate change. We absolutely, everyone is in favor of doing something about climate change. They'd rather their petrol price didn't go up in order to do it, or the cost of heating their house. But look, I think what we're seeing, let's wonder whether or not the second chance will be seized. I think there is an inspiring effort to seize the second chance going on in the United States. Joe Biden has basically gone for broke with his first 100 days in office, with an enormous fiscal stimulus, followed by an enormous public investment plan, followed by an enormous welfare spending proposal. Now, there's real questions as to how much of this will get through Congress and how it's going to be financed. But there's no doubt that he's trying to seize this second chance. And he's trying to do it quickly because he's not sure that he's still going to have a majority in Congress in 2 years' time. So maybe there's the opposite effect of what we were talking about, the sort of, never plan for the long term. Well, he's only got 2 years, he thinks. So he better go for it quickly.
And one of the things you may want to think about is the third area which you think we got it wrong, which is regulation of the banks and the financial sector. And you even said that regulation is not enough. So how did we manage to mess up the regulation of the banks after the financial crisis or during?
Well, I mean, the main way that, going back on that, I think the main way that things went wrong with the banks was that quite a lot of countries didn't want to face up to the hidden problems in their banking systems. Because to do so would have been costly and would have brought a lot of further difficulties to the fore and might have hurt confidence, they thought. So they deferred it. And this was particularly true of European governments, frankly, inside the Eurozone, which is why the Eurozone crisis didn't happen in 2008 or 2009 or even 2010. It happened in 2011, 2012, because so many of the problems had been kicked forward as governments decided not to really get a grip of their banking systems. Whereas the Americans did grab the banking system much more effectively immediately after the crisis.
In terms of trying to make sure that we come out of the crisis better and ensure that we don't mess up coming out of one, you talk about three areas. And the first area is about public investment, raising the trend growth rate and spending on productive things. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, I think under the pressure of austerity in the last 10 years, but also some degree out of complacency before, governments in the advanced countries cut back on public investment. It used to be very high in the 60s and 70s and even in the 80s, but it got cut back in the 90s and 2000s. And that then meant that our infrastructure is getting old, but also getting somewhat out of date. And that some of the things that can make our economies more productive, particularly things to do with digitalization, but also actually to some degree also in the education systems and elsewhere, have been at least added to more slowly. And investment in training, for example, of people, investment in labor, reallocating labor, of helping people find new jobs when they've lost their previous jobs, that has been sort of pared back, and that is a form of public investment. So I think that governments do need to resume a better balance between investment and current spending. Now, it's difficult because basically current spending is pensions, current spending is welfare, and you immediately think, oh God, how can I build that road or build that railway when I've got to pay the pension? So there is always a dilemma, but borrowing costs are incredibly low. We can borrow at the lowest rate for 300 years, right, currently. So I would say that for productive investment, we should be absolutely borrowing.
And one of the most interesting areas of your book was when you had some facts. So the percentage of the British population over 65 was 14% in 1994, 18.5% in 2014. In 2050, it'll be, in 2030, it'll be a quarter of the population. In 2050, it'll be a third. And one of the things you pointed out is that we have a sort of crocodile situation, crocodile's jaws. There's life expectancy and there's retirement age. But in order for people to want to work as they get older and be more productive, they have to have training, they have to have education. Because as you pointed out, the last time they were probably comprehensively trained for the workplace was 50 years ago. And so an area we really must start thinking about now is how to educate and work on skills for an aging population. That means that actually they're going to have a wage that's high enough for them to want to carry on.
Yeah, I know. I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think it's partly about the incentives to carry on, but it's also about making available at a reasonable cost that sort of further education and reinvestment in skills at all levels. We naturally tend to think of it as being things that sort of like professionals can get, but it needs to be at all levels. That's the thing. And I don't think we've set up the education system for that anymore. Further education colleges were set up for that in the past, but have generally, they still absolutely exist and still very valuable, but they probably need sort of some new investment.
Another area you feel that we need to do is to update our laws and regulations to deal with inequality. There were two things you mentioned to me. One is the funding of politics. There's also national minimum wage. You feel that the funding of politics is a particular problem. Can you talk about that a bit?
Well, I think it's a big problem in America, especially. That basically America has the best democracy money can buy, because there's absolutely no limit to what you can spend on campaigns. And they also obviously they have a system of very, very frequent elections. Because all restraints on how much you spend were removed by a Supreme Court decision a number of years ago, that then has just sort of turned it into a kind of financial arms race, which puts an enormous amount of power in the hands of big companies. You know, the big area of where American government, as with ours, should be regulating is technology companies. Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon, and so forth should be being dealt with partly out of antitrust issues because they're far too powerful and dominant, but also as an old media man, I would say that Facebook and others who are essentially acting as publishers should have the same responsibilities as a conventional publisher have for dealing with the information that is propagated through their platform. But they are so wealthy that they can basically bias Congress against doing that by funding their campaigns. So now there is a change of mood, and obviously public opinion in the end carries that decision, if you like. But the weight of money is extremely powerful. It's less important in Britain, although clearly some of the sleaze issues that we're seeing coming through about donors for being called upon to finance 10 Downing Street flat, the issues of VIP lanes for government contracts, which were essentially rewards for donations. And of course, the traditional issue in Britain is the purchase of peerages. That goes back to Lloyd George, as you know better than I do. So I think we can grasp these things. I mean, the other message I think we have to accept, though, of course, as we think about how to grasp them, is that the pandemic isn't over. And that's something that because another issue that we absolutely have to grasp is the fact that while vaccinations are going to get us into a much better place, in Britain already have, and in Europe and America, actually worldwide infection rates that are at a record high. Death rates in Latin America and India and other parts of Asia and Africa are very high. And the economic consequences of the pandemic for Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and some parts of Western Asia are also much worse than they have been for us. So that's going to affect us as long as that goes on. So I think we're not quite out of the woods yet in terms of grasping this second chance. So I think I should be realistic about that. We're not just talking about the future.
And one of the problems one of the things that many companies might have thought about, given a pandemic that's affected humans as much, is speeding up the move towards automation. And there's a particularly interesting area of the book where you point out the problems of changing thinking that there's going to be large investments in robots to do people's jobs, which is that investment needs to be accompanied, needs to be encouraged by growth in demand. But unlike in previous ways in which we improve productivity with people employees are also consumers. Robots are not consumers. So one of the things that Peter Kahn has asked that is about universal basic income. Is that the answer to how we create the demand for when certain more jobs are automated? And what do you think of UBI as itself? You may have to explain it if some...
Universal basic income is the idea essentially that everyone should get a pension throughout their lives. In other words, we have a universal basic income for old age pensioners. And this is an extension of that same idea. In other words, a state-based payment at a modest but livable level, which is, after all, what the basic state pension is, extended not just to people over retirement age, but throughout their working lives. And I have difficulty working out how we will finance this, is my fundamental problem with it. So I prefer to think that, yes, we have to rethink how to provide a safety net, how to provide a stronger safety net. You know, we went through a period, if you like, in the last 50 years where the safety net was probably a disincentive to work and also produced all sorts of distortions in the way the economy worked. That a lot of that safety net then got weakened and dismantled. Now I think we have to re-establish it to some degree. And while I wouldn't go for universal basic income, I might go back to a negative income tax, which is that something that would be much more easily directed only at the poor. The worst thing about a universal basic income is that I would get it. I don't want to get that any more than I want a winter fuel allowance from the British taxpayer. What I would like is a minimum income guarantee that is directed only at the poor, those who genuinely don't have an income, and you can do that through a negative income tax.
I want to move on to the next section, because there are actually quite a lot of questions about this section. So the next thing that you want to talk about is international relations and global collaboration. In particular, you feel that it's necessary to find a balance between resilience and efficiency. Can you explain that?
Well, I think that's really a question of corporate behavior, but also of how we run, to some degree, run our public sector. But you know, I'm a great supporter of globalization, and I think that in many ways, some of the aspects of globalization are ones that have rescued us through this pandemic. You know, the digital technology that we're talking through has been a magnificent product of globalization. The highly effective supply chains, which was meant that the toilet roll shortage, famed sometime around this time last year, or maybe it was a little earlier, basically didn't last very long. We've never really run out of things. So actually, globalization is important, and it's important to keep it open, but we do have to invest something more in resilience, which means diversifying our supply of things, but also building stockpiles and making sure we've got some more cushions back there. We can't do everything as much on a just-in-time basis as we were in the past. But I don't want to, you know, I don't think we should veer rapidly into sort of an autarkic, sort of self-sufficient world, because had we had such a world, we would have done terribly during this pandemic. We've got through this precisely because we're actually very interconnected and because we've embraced technology. And technology absolutely is our friend for the future. We just have to make sure that we don't allow it to make us vulnerable in terms of paring things down so much that we don't get efficient.
One of our biggest challenges, and this is a question from Graham Lucas, one of our biggest challenges will be the UK's further relationship with the EU. This is to do with collaboration. In Brussels and London, there's still a lot of acrimony. What do you think has to be done to put our relations with our largest trading partner back on a more stable footing?
Well, unfortunately, I think time is probably going to be the main healing of this. I mean, the fact is that for any British government, geography matters strategically and in economics. We ain't going to be towed into the middle of the Atlantic or out into the Pacific. We're going to stay here 22 miles from France. So absolutely, in the long term, our most important relationships have to be with European neighbors. So I think that any government in time will seek to re-establish close relations with collaboration which is already there in defense. It's already there in intelligence to some degree. And now it's going to, I think, be reestablished gradually in areas of economics and trade over the next 5 to 10 years. But for this government, the problem is that their political life, this Conservative government, was so born out of Brexit and out of treating the European Union as not quite the enemy, but as it were, the entity that they were defining themselves by getting away from, that they've naturally, to some degree, bathed in acrimony and used it and exploited it. And basically the flames of that acrimony, if I may mix the metaphor, have been fanned by some large parts of the press, particularly the Daily Express, the Daily Telegraph, and the Daily Mail. So yeah, there is acrimony currently, but I think time will heal it because from both sides, a close relationship is in their interests, and absolutely future governments of whatever stripe, it doesn't matter. And it's not about rejoining the European Union, it's about basically following Britain's strategic interests.
Yeah. So, and related to that in a slightly different angle is the question I had written down was, do you believe in borders and why? But Tristan Powell, and a wonderful ex-student of mine, has asked, is the dream of a borderless Europe as conveyed through the Schengen zone a thing of the past because migration crises, infectious diseases and terrorism have put pressure on this concept?
I doubt if it's a thing of the past, but I mean, I think that what the European Union has learned from the migrant crisis is that when you are essentially an entity of 27 countries now, mainly operating your own systems, but delegating to Brussels, to the European Commission, some activities, but quite a limited range of activities, you are not then in a position to police a common border. You are not then, because you don't have an army, you don't have a navy, you don't have a border force. And actually all the governments of Europe do not want to have a political union that would give them those aspects of being a sovereign state. So I think that the weakness that was shown in the migrant crisis was just simply something that was inherent in the whole European construct. And that then puts at some limit on how far the vision of a borderless Europe can happen. But for trade, for the ease of lorries going around Europe, I think the pressure to get the Schengen zone back in functioning after the pandemic will be very strong. So I don't think it's gone forever. And not all countries were part of it anyway. That's the funny thing about the Schengen zone. Switzerland's part of it, Ireland and the UK are not.
One of the issues that you talk about in terms of the battle for liberal West and things like that, are that some aspects of it are actually contradictory. So you talk about the difficulty of balancing openness and equality, and also balancing liberty and fraternity. And that was interesting to think about. So can you explain those problems?
Well, I think openness and equality is the most fundamental one. I mean, I think all of our societies have, those that have flourished because they're open to ideas, they're open to new people, they're open to trade, they're open to competition. Basically, that openness is absolutely fundamental to all of our success since the Enlightenment, and possibly even from before. But that openness then causes disruption in a society. It produces change. It builds railways that then become the subject of the mill on the floss. It builds trade links that then cause coal mines to be closed and causing disruption and difficulty in parts of England. So you do need some leaning against the consequences of openness through a sense of equality of citizenship, through some redistribution, through public investment in aspects of governance that provide, even in a society where you are welcoming creative destruction and disruption, you are welcoming it, you are softening it, and you are making everyone feel as much as you can as if they are citizens of that country, and they have a sense of collective benefit. And this, to be fair, is why immigration got to be such a problem, I think, in politics over the last 10 or 15 years, because coincident with the 2008 financial crisis, we had a very big rise in immigration, thanks to the decision to admit so many EU workers immediately when the EU was enlarged in 2004, and because Britain has a very open economy and very open labour market. The combination of that with the economic crisis after 2008 produced a backlash against immigration, which was a backlash against the inequality of citizenship that was perceived in a society of, as it were, a lack of control and a lack of government like compensating or at least dealing with the social consequences of disruption. And I think that's where we get to the austerity that comes in. So post-pandemic, we have to again think about the equality of the sense of citizenship that people need to feel as we kind of build back after the crisis. Now, the good thing is that actually we'll have a very strong economic rebound because we've got an enormous amount of pent-up savings and to spend. There's going to be a bigger danger of inflation than there is of stagnation over the next 2 years. So that then provides more of the room for government then to redistribute some of the flow of growing money to help people and to help those who've suffered most during the pandemic. So the second chance that we spoke about earlier is a bit easier to grasp this time, because it's going to be in a period of plenitude rather than a period of scarcity.
Now we're talking about collaboration. I'd like to ask Simon Manley to ask his question, please, about a country that isn't as great at collaboration as we might hope.
Thanks very much, Paul, and very nice to see you, Bill. Last time in Madrid, now in Geneva. So can I just ask you kind of what you see the role of China to be in sort of addressing the sort of challenges you've identified? Ally, competitor, enemy?
Well, definitely competitor, Simon. There's no doubt about that. No doubt about that. Look, I mean, they are the world's biggest producer of vaccines so far. They've produced 400 million doses of their 2 vaccines so far. And that's more than double, I think, the nearest rival up to April. So they are an ally in helping to bring the pandemic nearer to an end around the world. So they are going to, because they share an interest in doing that, as well as wanting to exploit their vaccines for diplomatic reasons. So, but they are above all a competitor, but they're a market, but they're a competitor, and they're a strategic competitor. And they are a country whose mentality is to some degree like the United States, in that they're basically very inward looking. They basically 1.4 billion people with the history that China has. They essentially think internally and think about simply their interests. And therefore we should see them as a bit parallel to the United States. It's just that we know that the United States is in the end our friend and our ally. As Churchill said, you can always rely on America to do the right thing once it's exhausted the alternatives, and that you cannot always rely on China to do the right thing once it's exhausted its alternatives. So absolutely they're a competitor, and we mustn't become dependent on them.
Thank you. And before we move on to the pandemic, I just want to come to a great economist and even greater footballer. Harjeet Ahluwalia, can you ask your question, please?
Thank you, Mr. Goldsmith, to me still, unfortunately. Bill, good evening. Just given the changing landscape of money and payments, do you see the potential for the creation of an electric form of currency, so like a digital currency that central banks would start to print? I've seen a few articles about this previously, but curious to know your opinions.
Well, I think it's quite a technical area, so I hesitate slightly, but I'm not going to hesitate much. I mean, I'm always prepared to bluff my way through a subject like this. But I think that it's inevitably an area that central banks are going to operate in. After all, what's the difference? I mean, ask yourself, how much of your currency is anything other than digital and electronic? It's not clear, absolutely clear, that there's much difference between a digital central bank issued currency and any other. It's all just noughts and ones anyway. But secondly, actually the blockchain related sort of cryptocurrencies are something of a lesson to central banks, that they can seek to sort of set up competitors to that and, you know, create currency in that way. And I think they will. You know, the big question, perhaps, which links together with Simon Manley's, is whether China would do that in a way that could accelerate any move away from the dollar. And the answer to that is that would be a hell of an effort. And the dollar is going to, in my view, going to remain dominant for as long as I can foresee. But almost the only way that you could alter the dollar's dominance would be by setting up an alternative payment system that enable people to circumvent the SWIFT system, that circumvents the dollar system, and, if you like, puts payments out of the reach of American extraterritorial sanctions and all of that sort of thing. So that in that digital area, there probably is something to be looked at. So I'm sure China is examining how it could do that. But I'd still bet on the dollar.
An interesting question has come in from Pauline Campbell. Pauline, you able to ask your question?
Yeah, hi, thanks. So because we kind of started talking about strategic imperatives, I mean, somebody else had asked a question about big government. My take on that is, isn't this all kind of slightly tinkering at the edges? When you look at, we talk about supply chains, which relies very heavily on shipping, which is one of the most polluting forms of transport, and will take an enormous amount of investment to make it otherwise. And that investment will have to be paid for ultimately by the consumer, which will probably have a bigger impact on, you know, the inequality. So when these goods that are being transported across the world cost more, they have a bigger impact on those who have less already. And those people who have less already are not organised into any of these interest groups that you talk about. They have no power and are at the point where they're accepting 0 hours contracts, etc. Now, I'm sort of putting together a number of, not extreme because they're all real, points to say, when we're facing that, what really is the strategic move that we have to make? Because somewhere, if you really want to level up, you can't do it by increments. You really have to kind of set a vision and then really set a course, which will be tough for a lot of people, including people who pay tax, etc. So I'm just interested in what's the real move that should be made?
Well, I mean, that's an enormous question. But I mean, I think if you're talking about inequality, I do think that regulating the sort of insecurity of labor that comes with 0 hours contracts would make a big difference. I think that we have made already a terrific impact through minimum wage, but that then doesn't get very far if you are on 0 hours contracts and you're just basically then you may be being paid the right minimum wage for the 1 hour you get. So I do think that we're going to have to accept some sort of quite increased regulation of the labor market in that sense. But if you go to, you're also basically bringing in climate change there, and in terms of the cost of shipping. Well, the good news is that a lot more is becoming digital, so that actually, since services are so much a part of all of our costs, actually the costs of these things have reduced. I think that the good news about climate change is that the costs of the energy transition are falling every year, and have fallen dramatically. The big exception to that is in shipping. where you're right to identify that it is as yet unclear what will be the sort of economic replacement for bunker fuel. But there's a lot of work going on, far be it from me I can mention ammonia and hydrogen and various things, but I mean, I don't really understand it. I haven't looked at it, but I think that that's going to have to be a sort of a big area, probably of some government supported research, if we're to accelerate that process. But from the point of view of income inequality, I'm not sure that area is such a big worry. In other words, I think that is more for the higher end of the consumer who gets affected by that.
I mean, just a sort of a quick follow-up, but because I mean, I sort of back to where you started, because actually, if you need investment in the government-sponsored investment in fuels, if you need government intervention and settling the labour markets, it really does come down to, I mean, this is not a socialist soapbox or anything, but the question of taxing individuals or corporations really does come quite high on the agenda, doesn't it? And then, but that becomes very political, and therefore the economics sort of bumps along with the politics, doesn't it?
Well, all of this is political.
Mm.
Nothing about tax or government policy is not political. That's all political. Yeah. And so Rishi Sunak has already proposed raising the corporation tax.
Yes, I know. Yeah.
So he's already trying to grasp that political nettle, and you can see it with what Biden's doing. He's proposing to raise capital gains tax to make it equal with income tax. I don't think he'll succeed in that. He's proposing to raise corporate taxes. I think he will succeed in.
Yes, I think so.
At least part of that. So there is a push towards some higher taxes, and these are intensely political.
I'm going to have to move on to the pandemic now, and he has been having a debate on QE, and he has reminded us he's only 17. But Ben Miller has a question for you, Bill. Go on, Ben.
So is the recent pandemic and all of the effects that have been happening across the world, is that more a proof of how neoliberal economics and the neoliberal economic system has succeeded, or a proof of its failure?
Can you start? So the pandemic itself, you were asking about the health. Yes. Yeah.
So the pandemic and then the sort of global interconnected response to that.
Yeah, so just Bill, he phrased it very well when he wrote it. Is the pandemic more a sign that capitalism and neoliberal economic policy is failing, or is it a sign of the economic system's success?
Well, I think if you make me choose one of the two, I'd say it's a sign of success, actually. But I think that the fact that we had this pandemic and it was much worse than the previous sort of spreads of infection across borders that we'd seen before, SARS in 2003 or the H5N1 more recently, suggests that basically we haven't grasped how to actually stop the spread of infection. But the fact that this is something that we've responded to in the advanced countries so successfully in terms of financially and then in terms of the sort of like adaptation suggests that actually capitalism is working well. Our public health systems didn't work as well, and that's more to do with the public sector. So I'd say it showed the weakness in our public health systems. It showed weaknesses in our preparation, which again is mainly governmental, but actually the response of capitalism has been incredibly strong. Now, we're in 2021, we're only in year 2 of this crisis. So what you should say back to me is, well, wait a minute, what's going to happen in years 3, 4, and 5? And how well will things evolve after this? And in particular, how well will they evolve in parts of the world where the pandemic is absolutely going to be continuing to rage on, in Africa, in Latin America, as we can see it happening in India? What will that do to capitalism and supply chains? And of course, the answer is it's in the future. I don't know, but I shouldn't be declaring victory too quickly.
So one of the last thing that you wanted to get over with and get over, audience, we have 8 minutes. So if you've got more questions, please put it in the chat. Is you feel that we are still incredibly vulnerable to future viruses? Why is that so?
Well, I think that in a more crowded world, the chance that we've seen, the evidence is that the chances of viruses hopping from animal to human, from species to species, have increased. But actually, this is a phenomenon of that's probably always been with us. HIV/AIDS was exactly that, and killed tens of millions of people worldwide, many more than the coronavirus has done so far. HIV/AIDS was the very biggest such animal to human transmitted viral disease that showed our vulnerability. And now the pandemic has shown how an infection like this can spread incredibly rapidly. So it's clear that this is a fact of modern life, a fact of maybe a world in which there are nearly 8 billion people living in the planet, the fact of increased interconnection, but also something that we can put some guarding against. If we had better surveillance systems, for example, a wider range of laboratories testing for the emergence of new viruses and sharing the information across borders. Some more investment in the sort of stockpiles of equipment and of materials that we need. We've proved that we needed to be able to respond quickly and get these things bashed on the head quickly. Probably a new lot of investment and development of the sorts of technologies, app-based technologies that actually have been a big failure during this pandemic. Nobody has made a success out of test and trace through apps, except possibly South Korea. Next time, that had better work. So there are a lot of lessons to be learned.
There's been, thank you for that. There's been a little debate on the chat, and so I'm going to ask for your thoughts on governments safely and responsibly creating or printing money to add to their income from taxation and borrowings.
Well, I'm against. No, I mean, look, I think the idea of this is modern monetary theory. Increased government spending would not generate inflation as long as there is unused economic capacity. Well, yes, but how could you tell is the difficulty with that. I mean, that's a sort of new version of the Phillips curve, saying that you won't get inflation until you get to a certain point in the way unemployment falls. And then we found that actually the relationships all broke down. And I think that that's going to be the case with modern monetary theory. I don't think that central banks will be able to continue creating and printing money indefinitely. At the moment, it's absolutely right to finance government spending in this way because borrowing costs are incredibly low. But as soon as you see inflation rise in the US, and it's begun to rise, and there's going to be basically 6, 7, 8% growth in the US in the next 12 months. We'll probably see 6, 7% growth in the UK this year. That's after a 10% drop last year. But nevertheless, we're going to be pretty quickly using up our theoretical capacity. So inflation is going to come back. So interest rates are going to rise. So debt is going to start to be a bind again. So I'm afraid there isn't a way of reinventing the world in this sense. And I don't think Maynard Keynes would have thought that either.
And as we begin to wrap up, I thought it would be useful, since once people have generously donated to the Latimer Foundation, if they have some money left over, they could look no further than your new book on Japan. Can you tell us a little bit about that book? Because we haven't covered Japan today, but it's a particularly interesting area of your the liberals book too, liberalism book.
Oh, well, you're very kind. No, so my book on Japan was called Japan's Far More Female Future. And it is essentially saying that Japan's key asset during the time when when Andrew Knight, who's on this call, I noticed, sent me to Japan as a correspondent for The Economist in 1983, the key asset for Japan was its workers, its human capital, well educated, but that human capital was all men, and they were very well trained in the companies that they worked for. What's happened since the financial crash of 1990 is that training has declined of men, and therefore the human capital of Japan has declined. And the rest of the population, women, have not been given the chance to, as it were, to use their human capital in the same way. What I'm arguing in that book and what I try to analyze in that book is to say, actually, Japan can prosper if it finds a way both to use the brilliant education of its men better, but above all, if it can use the brilliant education of its women better and give them the chance to be productive, to be fulfilled in the way that they want to be. And I was sort of predicting that this will happen because I think the pressure of the new generation is going to change it. So this was a book trying to promote a certain social change in Japan, but also to predict it.
And just there is a question that has come in from Julian G, who's in Brazil. Julian, you able to ask your question? If not, I can ask it.
Hi, Bill. Just curious, you were talking about pent-up demand in places like the UK and the US, and given that developing countries are, as we're seeing in Brazil and India, pose such a threat to developed countries and the rest of the world. Do you think that the world needs to review its concept of overseas investments and aid in trying to tackle some of the deep-seated issues that we've seen over the last year?
Well, I think it's a good question. I think that there's a huge need for overseas aid for building up the vaccine program, for building the supply of vaccines. I mean, there's an enormous shortage of vaccines. But what there also has been in a lot of developing countries is that thanks to the pandemic, testing of and medical responses to other diseases have dropped enormously, of tuberculosis, of malaria, of HIV/AIDS, of other endemic diseases. So there is an increased public health crisis going on in a lot of parts of the developing world that has been caused by the pandemic, even in places where actually until now the direct impact of COVID has been more modest than in the West. So I think this is going to have a debilitating effect on those countries, probably cause some political instability, and it's going to have some debilitating effect on world trade and the world economy. So both for humanitarian and for political and economic reasons, I do think that there's going to be a big case for increased overseas aid and development spending to try to remedy some of those direct and indirect health consequences of the pandemic. Yes, we have to be realistic on how much you can achieve. I think a lot can be achieved in the vaccination program because that's relatively centralized, relatively easy to pour money into it and get things done. Much harder to pour money into dealing with rebuilding tuberculosis programs in Mali or in Chad or in all sorts of parts of the developed world. But we do have the global fund for TB, malaria, and HIV/AIDS, which I'm sure would like another few billion dollars to be able to strengthen its work. And I do think that there's going to be a lot to be done to repair some of the consequences of this.
Thank you. I'll pass you back to Joanna.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for picking up from where you left off, in fact, from your talk earlier in the year. and for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us all this evening, from public investment and inequality to international relations and animal to human virus hopping. It has definitely been very thought-provoking and an absolute privilege to have you back. A huge thank you also to Paul Goldsmith for once again being such a superb host and making this last hour so incredibly captivating. And of course, thank you, our audience, for your great questions and continued support for our online talks. And since we started the series last summer, your donations at registration have raised over £23,000 for our bursaries appeal. And if you haven't already and would like to contribute, please do copy out the link to the donations page from our chat bar now. If you'd like to catch up on Bill's previous talk, or indeed any of the other talks from our series, again, there is a link to our video library in the chat also. And next Tuesday evening, we have a very special evening with film producer Tracy Scofield, who will discuss The Making of Small Axe, a collection of 5 films directed by Steve McQueen, and as of last week was the most nominated programme in the BAFTA history with 15 nominations. If you would like to join us for what promises to be a fascinating insight into the making of a major drama series, then please copy the forthcoming events link in the chat to find out more and register. Sadly, that brings us to the end of this evening's talk. As always, thank you for joining us tonight, and thank you both again, Bill and Paul, for this informative hour. I hope we see you all again very soon. Good night.